Leader of what prosecutors are calling one of the largest human smuggling operations in the country pleaded guilty today to running the organization. 52-year-old Eduardo Domingo Renoj-Matul, also known as Turko, was accused of illegally bringing around 20,000 Guatemalan immigrants into the U.S.
Also charged, Jose Pastor Oxley, who was already behind bars for killing 7 immigrants, including 3 children, in a 2023 car crash in Oklahoma that happened during a transport from New York to Los Angeles. Another suspect, Elmer Obispo Hernandez, is on the run after authorities say he threatened to kill a federal agent.
It started with a promise of a better life in America. But behind that promise was a man who authorities now say quietly built one of the largest human smuggling empires the United States has ever seen. For years, thousands of desperate people from Guatemala believed they were paying for a chance at freedom. Families sold land, borrowed money, and emptied their life savings to raise as much as $15,000. Sometimes even $18,000 for the journey. They thought they were buying hope. What many of them didn't know was that they were stepping into a shadowy network that stretched across multiple countries, run by a man known by many names. Some called him Turko. Others knew him as El Jefe. To some in the underground smuggling world, he was simply Patrón, the boss. But his real name was Eduardo Domingo Renoj-Matul. For nearly 5 years, according to U.S. federal authorities, this 52-year-old Guatemalan national orchestrated a massive pipeline moving people from the villages of Guatemala through Mexico and deep into cities across the United States. Drivers, smuggling cells, secret stash houses, an entire underground system designed to move human beings across borders like cargo. Investigators say the operation was staggering in scale. By the time authorities finally uncovered it, nearly 20,000 migrants had allegedly passed through the network. 20,000 lives, 20,000 stories, 20,000 people risking everything for the chance to start over. But the journey many of them took was far darker than they ever imagined. Because once they crossed into the United States, the nightmare often didn't end. For some, it was only just beginning. Hidden inside a building in Los Angeles, investigators say migrants were kept in what authorities described as a stash house, a place where people who had already risked their lives crossing borders were suddenly trapped again, locked inside, waiting. Some were not allowed to leave. Some were held against their will. And while families back home believed their loved ones were already safe in America, desperate phone calls were being made behind the scenes. According to prosecutors, migrants were sometimes held there until their smuggling debts were fully paid. If the money didn't come fast enough, the threats began. In one case, authorities say a migrant was held hostage for months. Another victim was allegedly told something even more terrifying: pay the money, or suffer the consequences. And sometimes the threats didn't stop with the migrants themselves. Families thousands of miles away were dragged into the fear. Investigators say Renoj-Matul personally threatened one migrant's mother, warning that harm could come if the smuggling fees were not paid. Imagine receiving a call like that. Your child is somewhere in another country. You thought they had finally made it to safety. But now someone is telling you they are being held, and that their life may depend on how quickly you can find thousands of dollars. This was the terrifying reality prosecutors say some families faced, and the money always kept moving. Authorities say payments collected in Los Angeles were transferred to Phoenix, helping finance the broader smuggling operation and paying partners involved in transporting migrants across borders. Meanwhile, the network kept expanding. Migrants who made it through were transported across the country, from Florida to New York, Tennessee to Washington, D.C., Georgia, Illinois, Colorado, Virginia, and beyond. To the outside world, it looked invisible. But to federal investigators quietly piecing together the operation, the scale of the network was becoming impossible to ignore. For years, the man at the center of it all continued operating in the shadows, until the day the system finally began to collapse. And when it did, the man known as El Jefe found himself standing in a U.S. federal courtroom, facing charges that could keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. The man known as El Jefe stood quietly in a federal courtroom, the weight of years of secrecy finally catching up to him. For the first time in a long time, the man who had controlled the movement of thousands of people across borders was no longer the one in charge. But to understand how Eduardo Domingo Renoj-Matul reached that moment, you have to go back years before the courtroom, before the arrests, before investigators even knew his name. The story begins in Guatemala. In many parts of Guatemala, opportunity is scarce. Entire families survive on small farms, tiny street businesses, or daily labor that barely brings in enough to feed a household. For years, the dream of leaving for the United States has lived in the minds of many people there. The promise is simple. In America, they say, there are jobs. In America, there is safety. In America, there is a chance to build something better for your children. But getting there legally is extremely difficult, and for many families, now it feels almost impossible. That is where the smugglers enter the story. Word spreads quietly through villages and towns. Someone knows someone who can help people reach the United States. Someone who has connections along the border. Someone who knows drivers, guides, and routes that bypass immigration checkpoints. At first, these smugglers are often introduced through trusted friends or relatives. A cousin might say they know someone who helped another family member cross successfully. A neighbor might whisper the name of a man who has sent many people to America. One of those names, investigators say, eventually led people to Eduardo Domingo Renoj-Matul. In the smuggling world, names carry power, but rarely do people use real ones. Instead, nicknames move through the underground network like coded signals. To Turko, El Gallo, Patrón, El Jefe. These were the names that began circulating among those looking for a way north. At the center of it all was a promise. If you could gather enough money, the network would take care of the rest. For most migrants, the cost was staggering. Authorities later revealed that people paid anywhere between $15,000 and $18,000 for the journey. In many Guatemalan communities, that amount of money is more than what someone might earn in several years. But families still found ways. Some sold their land. Some borrowed money from relatives. Others took dangerous loans from lenders who expected repayment no matter what happened during the journey. For many families, sending one person to America was seen as an investment. If that person succeeded, they could send money home and lift the entire family out of poverty. So they took the risk. Once the money was arranged, the journey began. According to investigators, the smuggling network Renoj-Matul operated like a carefully organized pipeline stretching across multiple countries. The first stage began in Guatemala. migrants were gathered and prepared for travel. Sometimes they were moved in small groups to avoid attracting attention. They might board buses or vans headed north, leaving behind their homes and families with little more than a backpack and hope. From Guatemala, they would enter Mexico. Mexico is vast, and the routes used by smugglers constantly change. Some migrants traveled by vehicle. Others were forced to move on foot through remote areas where law enforcement presence was low. Along the way, different criminal groups controlled different parts of the journey. Authorities later explained that Mexican smuggling organizations played a major role in transporting migrants across the country and toward the U.S. border. These groups were not working for free. Every part of the journey required money, coordination, and people willing to take risks. Once migrants reached northern Mexico, the most dangerous part of the journey awaited them: crossing the U.S.-Mexico border. For many migrants, this moment was both terrifying and hopeful. Some crossed through remote desert areas guided by smugglers who knew the terrain. Others were hidden inside vehicles attempting to pass through checkpoints. The conditions were often brutal. Extreme heat during the day, freezing temperatures at night, little water, or long hours walking through harsh landscapes. But if they made it across the border into the United States, many believed the worst part was finally over. What they didn't realize was that the network waiting for them on the other side was just as complex. According to prosecutors, once migrants crossed into the United States, Renoj-Matul's organization took control again. Teams of drivers were waiting. These drivers were responsible for moving migrants away from the border and transporting them to different locations across the country. Sometimes they traveled in packed vehicles, trying to avoid detection on highways. The destinations varied widely. Authorities later identified migrants being transported to states like Florida, New York, Georgia, Illinois, Tennessee, Colorado, and Virginia, as well as Washington, D.C. Each trip was another link in a chain that investigators say ultimately moved nearly 20,000 people. But not every migrant was immediately delivered to their destination. Some were taken somewhere else first. A place investigators would later call a stash house. One such location was in Los Angeles. To the outside world, the building looked ordinary. It sat among other structures in a busy city where thousands of people passed by every day without noticing anything unusual. But inside, according to federal authorities, migrants were sometimes being held. Some had already paid their smuggling fees. Others had not. In cases where the full payment hadn't been completed, the migrants might not be allowed to leave. The arrangement was simple but cruel. Until the money arrived, the migrants stayed. So phone calls were made to families. Messages were sent demanding payment. Sometimes the pressure intensified. Investigators say that in certain situations, migrants were effectively held hostage until their families could gather the remaining money. For the families receiving those calls, the fear was overwhelming. They had already sacrificed so much to send their loved ones on the journey. Now they were being told that the person they hoped had reached safety was still trapped somewhere far away. And the clock was ticking. By the early 2020s, federal investigators were beginning to hear fragments of this story. Human smuggling operations are notoriously difficult to track. They often span multiple countries and involve dozens of individuals who each handle a small part of the process. But slowly, the pieces of information began reaching authorities. Some migrants who escaped or were rescued told investigators about stash houses. Others described the network of drivers moving people across states. Financial transactions also began drawing attention. Large sums of money were moving through different cities, including Los Angeles and Phoenix. Investigators suspected that the money was tied to smuggling payments, but at the center of the operation was still a shadowy figure known mostly by nicknames: Turko, El Jefe. For years, he remained just out of reach. Authorities continued building their case, tracing connections between drivers, stash houses, and financial transfers. Every arrest revealed another layer of the network. And slowly, the name Eduardo Domingo Renoj-Matul began appearing in their investigation. By then, they were starting to understand something alarming. This wasn't a small smuggling ring. It was one of the largest operations they had ever encountered. Thousands of migrants, millions of dollars moving through the system, drivers, coordinators, and partners working across borders. And at the top of it all was a man living in the United States, while quietly directing the movement of human beings through an underground empire. But what investigators were about to discover next would reveal something even darker. Because for some migrants caught inside the network, the journey didn't just involve smuggling, it involved fear, threats, and captivity. And as authorities dug deeper into the case, they began uncovering stories that would transform the investigation from a smuggling case into something far more disturbing. At first, the stories sounded almost unbelievable. Investigators had spent years working cases involving human smuggling. They had seen overcrowded vehicles, dangerous desert crossings, and migrants abandoned by smugglers trying to avoid arrest. But what some victims were describing was something more controlled, more deliberate. This was not just about moving people across a border. It was about power and control. Some migrants told investigators that after arriving in the United States, they expected to be released quickly so they could begin working and repay the money their families had borrowed for the journey. Instead, they were taken to houses where they were told to wait. Days passed. Then weeks. In some cases, months. The doors were watched carefully. Migrants were not free to walk outside. Phones were tightly controlled. But sometimes they were allowed to contact family members, but those conversations were not about reassurance. They were about money. Investigators later learned that these calls were often part of a strategy. Families would hear the fear in their loved one's voice. They would hear the urgency. And then they would hear the message. The fee had not been fully paid. More money was required. Until that payment arrived, the migrant would remain where they were. For families thousands of miles away in Guatemala, these calls were terrifying. Many of them had already paid the original smuggling fee, sometimes by selling everything they owned. Now they were being told the price had changed. If they didn't find the money quickly, their son, daughter, or sibling might remain trapped indefinitely. And sometimes the threats became darker. According to federal prosecutors, Renoj-Matul admitted that at least 2 migrants were held hostage during 2024. One of them was detained from May 2024 until July 2024. For nearly 2 months, the person was not allowed to leave. Authorities say Renoj-Matul personally threatened the migrant's mother during that time. The message was chilling. If the smuggling debt wasn't paid, harm could come to her child. Imagine being a parent receiving that call. Your child had left home chasing a dream. Now someone was telling you that dream had turned into a nightmare, and there was nothing you could do except try to raise thousands of dollars you didn't have. Another victim experienced something similar. Investigators say a second migrant was held from April 2024 until July 2024. During that time, threats escalated. Authorities later revealed that Renoj-Matul threatened to kill, injure, or continue detaining the victim if a third party didn't send the remaining smuggling payment. The fear in those situations is difficult to imagine. You are in a country where you know no one. You may not speak the language. You are locked inside a building. And the people controlling your fate are demanding money from your family. For the smugglers running the operation, these tactics were part of a larger system designed to keep the money flowing. Investigators would later uncover how carefully the financial side of the operation was managed. Payments didn't always stay in one place. According to authorities, smuggling fees collected in Los Angeles were sometimes transferred to Phoenix, Arizona. From there, the money could be distributed to other parts of the network. Some of it went toward paying the Mexican smuggling organizations that helped move migrants across the border. Other funds were used to cover transportation costs, drivers, and stash houses. In his plea agreement, Renoj-Matul admitted something investigators had suspected all along. He was doing it for profit, private financial gain. Behind the complex network of routes, drivers, and stash houses was a business, and it was extremely lucrative. Think about the numbers. If a migrant paid even the lower end of the fee, $15,000, and 20,000 people passed through the network, the total amount of money involved would reach hundreds of millions of dollars. That scale is what first caught investigators' attention. Large sums moving between cities, connections between drivers and safe houses, people appearing in different states after crossing the border. Gradually, a picture began to form. At the center of it all was the man known as El Jefe. But building a case against someone like Renoj-Matul was not easy. Human smuggling networks are built to hide. Each person in the operation usually knows only a small part of the system. Drivers know their routes. House operators know their location. Financial couriers move money. But very few people see the entire structure. That structure protects the leaders. If someone is arrested, they can only reveal a small piece of the puzzle. Federal investigators knew they needed time. They began collecting evidence piece by piece. Surveillance, financial records, statements from migrants who had been smuggled through the network. And eventually, they began identifying key members of the organization. One of them was Cristobal Mejia Chaj. Authorities described him as Renoj-Matul's right-hand man, someone deeply involved in the operation and trusted with important responsibilities. Another figure investigators identified was Jose Paxtor Oxlage. According to prosecutors, he worked as a driver within the smuggling network. Drivers were critical to the operation. They were the ones physically moving migrants across long distances inside the United States. Every successful trip meant more money flowing back to the organization. But investigators believed there was another key player, a man named Helmer Obispo Hernandez. Authorities say he acted as a lieutenant within the organization, someone with significant authority inside the network. But unlike the others, Obispo Hernandez had managed to disappear. By the time federal agents moved in to make arrests, he was gone. To this day, authorities still consider him a fugitive. Meanwhile, the investigation continued tightening around Renoj-Matul. Agents traced communications. They examined how migrants moved from one location to another. They mapped the flow of money between cities. Little by little, The underground empire that had operated for years was becoming visible. And when investigators finally felt they had enough evidence, the next phase of the operation began. The arrests. For many people involved in the network, that moment arrived suddenly. Drivers were taken into custody. Associates were questioned. And eventually, the man known as El Jefe was arrested. And the leader of the smuggling network was no longer operating in the shadows. He was now facing the full power of the U.S. federal justice system. But the most dramatic moment in the case was still to come. Because when Renoj-Matul finally stood before a judge in federal court, something unexpected happened. Instead of fighting the charges, he admitted what investigators had spent years trying to prove. He pleaded guilty. And with that single decision, the story of one of the largest human smuggling operations in the United States began moving toward its final chapter. But the courtroom where he made that admission would soon reveal just how serious the consequences could be. Because the charges Renoj-Matul faced carried a punishment that could change the rest of his life. On a punishment so severe that if the judge decides to impose the maximum sentence, the man once known as El Jefe could spend the rest of his life behind bars. The moment Eduardo Domingo Renoj-Matul admitted his guilt in federal court, the atmosphere in the room shifted. For years, investigators had been working quietly to build a case strong enough to bring down what they believed was one of the largest human smuggling operations ever uncovered in the United States. Evidence had been collected piece by piece. Financial records, witness statements, surveillance, and testimonies from migrants who had passed through the network. Now, the man at the center of it all had finally said the words himself. He admitted it. You, the man known in the underground smuggling world as Turko, El Gallo, Patrón, and El Jefe, stood before a federal judge and acknowledged his role in the operation. For prosecutors, it was a turning point. For the victims and families affected by the network, it was a moment many had been waiting for. But even as Renoj-Matul accepted responsibility, the full scope of the operation continued to unfold in court filings and investigative reports. Authorities revealed that the smuggling organization had operated like a sophisticated criminal enterprise. It wasn't just a handful of individuals moving people across the border. It was a system, a pipeline stretching from the villages of Guatemala to the highways of the United States. Recruiters, transporters, stash house operators, financial handlers, fee and drivers, each playing a role in keeping the operation running. And according to investigators, the organization was responsible for moving approximately 20,000 migrants into the United States between 2019 and July of 2024. 20,000 people, 20,000 journeys. Some of those journeys ended with migrants reaching relatives or jobs in American cities. But for others, the path was far more traumatic. Stories shared with investigators revealed moments of fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty that migrants carried with them long after the journey ended. Some described traveling in overcrowded vehicles where they could barely move. Others spoke of long hours hiding from authorities, unsure if they would be abandoned in the desert or delivered safely to their destination. And then there were those who ended up inside the stash houses, small, hidden spaces where migrants were sometimes kept, while smugglers waited for payments to be completed. In those rooms, time moved slowly. Days blended into nights. Some migrants had no idea where they were. They only knew that until someone paid the remaining money, they weren't leaving. Authorities would later confirm that Renoj-Matul himself admitted to holding 2 migrants hostage during 2024. The threats that followed those detentions painted a disturbing picture of how the operation enforced its control. Phone calls were made. Families were pressured. Money was demanded. It was a strategy designed to ensure that every dollar owed to the smuggling network was eventually collected. But by 2024, something had started to change. Federal investigators were closing in. The evidence they had gathered was no longer just fragments of a larger story. It was a detailed map of a criminal organization. Financial trails connected cities, witness statements connected names, transportation routes connected drivers to the central network, and slowly, the identity of the man orchestrating the system became undeniable. Eduardo Domingo Renoj-Matul. When authorities finally moved to dismantle the network, several individuals tied to the operation were charged. Among them were 2 men prosecutors described as key members of the organization. Jose Pastor Oxlage, a driver believed to have transported migrants within the United States, and Cristobal Mejia Chaj, a man authorities described as Renoj-Matul's right-hand man, and both men were arrested and charged for their roles in the operation. Unlike Renoj-Matul, however, they chose to fight the accusations. Both pleaded not guilty. Their trial was scheduled to begin on April 21st, where prosecutors would present evidence connecting them to the smuggling network. But the investigation didn't end there. Authorities also identified another figure believed to have played an important role inside the organization. A man named Helmer Obispo Hernandez. Prosecutors described him as a lieutenant within the criminal network, someone trusted with significant responsibilities. But by the time federal agents attempted to arrest him, he had disappeared. To this day, Obispo Hernandez remains a fugitive, and authorities continue searching for him. Meanwhile, and inside the federal courtroom where Renoj-Matul had entered his guilty plea, the legal process continued moving forward. By admitting to the charges, Renoj-Matul avoided a lengthy trial, but his admission did not erase the seriousness of the crimes. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy to bring migrants into the United States for financial gain, including transporting and harboring them. He also pleaded guilty to hostage-taking. That second charge carries particularly severe penalties under U.S. law. Hostage-taking cases are treated with extreme seriousness because they involve threats of violence and coercion against vulnerable individuals. In Renoj-Matul's case, the court would consider not only the scale of the smuggling operation, but also the way migrants were allegedly detained and threatened. But the possible punishment was staggering. Under federal law, the maximum sentence for the charges Renoj-Matul faced could reach life in prison. The man who had once directed a massive underground network now faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars. The next major step in the case was scheduled for October 2nd. That would be the day Renoj-Matul returned to court for sentencing. On that day, the judge will review the evidence, the plea agreement, and the recommendations from prosecutors and defense attorneys. Then the judge will decide how many years the man once known as El Jefe will spend in prison. For Renoj-Matul, the wait for that day represents the final chapter of a journey that began years earlier in the shadows of an underground smuggling world. But the impact of the case goes far beyond one man. And investigators say dismantling this operation disrupted a network responsible for moving thousands of migrants across borders. It exposed the complex structure behind modern smuggling operations. Organizations that operate like businesses with logistics, finances, and international partnerships, and it revealed how vulnerable people searching for a better life can become trapped inside systems that profit from their desperation. For the families who borrowed money, sold possessions, and took enormous risks hoping to reach the United States, the dream of a better future often came with dangers they never imagined. Some eventually made new lives for themselves. Others were caught in the middle of a criminal enterprise that treated human beings as commodities. As the case against Renoj-Matul moves toward sentencing, and it stands as a stark reminder of how powerful and far-reaching these smuggling networks can become. For years, the man known as El Jefe operated quietly, directing an operation that stretched across borders and moved thousands of people through hidden routes. But in the end, the same system that helped him build that empire also left behind a trail of money, a trail of witnesses, a trail investigators eventually followed all the way back to him. And now, as he waits for the judge's decision that could determine the rest of his life, the story of Eduardo Domingo Renoj-Matul has moved from the shadows of the smuggling world into the public record. A case that began with whispers in small villages and secret journeys across borders now ends in a courtroom where justice is about to deliver its final verdict.